A very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us today for the ISIS webinar titled Bangladesh, What's Next? The panel will discuss the reasons behind Hasina's ouster, the internal challenges that Bangladesh faces, and the implications for the region's geopolitics. To speak on this today, we are delighted to have with us as guest speakers Dr. Nusrat Chaudhry, Associate Professor of Anthropology at Amherst College, Dr. Dina Siddiqui, Clinical Associate Professor of Global Liberal Studies at the New York University, Professor Roger Mohan, Visiting Research Professor at the Institute of South Asian Studies and US. Today's session will be chaired by Dr. Ronojoy Sen, Senior Research Fellow and Research Lead of Politics, Society and Governance at the Institute of South Asian Studies and US. Today's session will be live streamed and recorded live stream on the ISIS Facebook page. For our discussion section, you may send the questions through the chat box or use the Q&A option. Now I will hand it over to Dr. Sen to begin the session.
Thank you, Saad. A very warm welcome to today's discussion titled Bangladesh, What Next? As most of you are aware, on August 5th this year, hundreds of demonstrators stormed and ransacked Bangladesh Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina's official residence, forcing her to flee the country. This came after weeks of anti-government protests, and the situation in Bangladesh had reached a flashpoint a day earlier on August 4th, when nearly 100 people were killed and several hundreds injured in clashes between protesters and the police. What began in July 2024 as student protests against a quota, which reserved a third of government jobs for descendants of war veterans of the country's 1971 liberation struggle, grew rapidly into a broader agitation demanding political reform, government accountability, the protection of civil liberties, and the resignation of Sheikh Hasina. The escalation of the protests and the state's brutal response marked a significant turning point in the country's politics as Bangladeshi citizens increasingly questioned the legitimacy of the Awami League government, which had been in power for the past 15 years. Since Hasina's departure, an interim government led by economist and Nobel laureate Muhammad Yunus, which also includes 2 student representatives, is in place. The Economist magazine had headlined one of its recent stories, Bangladesh has ousted an autocrat, now for the hard part. While that certainly underestimates the struggles and difficulties in deposing an autocratic ruler, the interim government does face severe and several challenges. One of the immediate ones is to ensure law and order after days of chaos that saw attacks on the houses of Awami League politicians, sporadic attacks on minorities, some of which have been amplified and distorted on social media, and a general absence of policing. In the medium term, the cabinet must reorganize state institutions, including the Election Commission and other election-related bodies, to hold the next elections in an inclusive and democratic manner as soon as possible. The interim government is also preparing to investigate the killings over the past few weeks under the supervision of the United Nations. The murders conducted within the period from July 1st, 2024 to August 5th will be tried by the International Crimes Tribunal. Finally, there is the question of geopolitics, both within South Asia and outside, around the collapse of the Hasina government. India had been a strong backer of Sheikh Hasina, and it is where she spent many years in exile after almost her entire family was assassinated in 1975. India is also where she fled to on August 5th. Hasina's overthrow is undeniably a setback for India, which shared strong diplomatic and trade relations with Dhaka under Sheikh Hasina, and in whom India had invested a lot in recent years. Indian foreign policy is, of course, adjusting to the new reality. On its part, the Foreign Affairs Advisor of Bangladesh's interim government has said that the deposed Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina's extended stay in India will not hurt bilateral relations with Dhaka. There are also conspiracy theories about the dreaded foreign hand doing the rounds, with Sheikh Hasina as well as others pointing fingers at Washington for a current plight. However, as several analysts have noted, the chain of causal events lie within Bangladesh and not outside. To discuss and analyze the reasons behind Hasina's ouster, the internal challenges that Bangladesh faces, and the reasons geopolitics, we have a stellar panel. It gives me great pleasure to now invite Dr. Nusrat Chaudhry to speak about the events that led to Sheikh Hasina's ouster and really to set the context for today's discussion. The floor is yours, Nusrat.
Thank you. Thank you for this invitation to speak. I know it's the event is titled What Next, but I don't know what's next. The seismic shift that took place in Bangladesh in the past month or so, as Dr. Sen already pointed out, is still ongoing. These are unfolding events which pose particular challenges to analysts such as myself. So for the purposes of today's discussion, I would like to look backwards a little in order to understand what is unprecedented about the 2024 uprising and what is also deeply familiar about it. So as has already been pointed out, a movement to reform the quota system for equitable distribution of government jobs became the source of a movement that toppled a government that was in power for almost 16 years. As the political scientist Ali Riaz has recently said, it is the spark that started the fire. What was a bread and butter issue, barely covered in the media in its early days, in early July, became one of the most well-documented political events in independent Bangladesh. Observers of Bangladeshi politics, as well as ordinary citizens, have mostly been in agreement that the demand for reforms to the laws around affirmative action organically morphed into one that demanded larger reforms of the state itself, which translated into the ouster of the Prime Minister. All of this, as we have seen, came about because of the excessive violence used by the state, using its police, the border guards, the army, and the activists of the ruling party. At the outset, the events seemed rather formulaic. Similar demands before for, let's say, road safety or even the quota system itself in 2018 met with condescension, dismissal, or criminalization. But this time something was different. The same formula was not working. It seemed like whatever was being said by those in positions of power, every political category that was mobilized before to a certain end, began to only stoke the anger of the students and soon ordinary citizens. So what are some of these political categories? For the purposes of time, I'm going to offer 4 very briefly. The first is, of course, the student, Chatro, Rajakar or traitor, Chatro Janota, which is a hyphenated political entity that has been crucial in all the successful uprisings since before Bangladesh's independence, and the 4th being the miscreant or mob. So let's start with the category of the student. The figure of the student revolutionary is central in all of this, and it has been central to the populist uprisings in 1969, 1990, 2007, and of course in 2024. In 1969, it was against, the protests were against the dictatorship of Ayub Khan, in 1990 against the dictatorship of General Irshad, 2007 against the military-backed interim government, and in 2024 against Sheikh Hasina. While the student revolutionary is a main actor in these political face-offs, it's also important to keep in mind that university campuses themselves have played pivotal roles. In fact, if you read the reports of processions in 1969 against Ayub Khan's dictatorship, you will see uncanny resonances between the ways in which campuses offered or became fertile grounds of political mobilization. And given there are many more institutions of higher education in Bangladesh in 2024, the emergence of the campus as a war zone became all the more clear. So I argue that the category of the student in this most recent uprising has been mobilized in at least 2 ways. One, as a figure of innocence, which in this context means a category or an actor who is devoid of party political affiliations or aspirations, and also cynically by those in power for whom students, defined as such, could not participate in what they described as mayhem. So here, I think it's important to question what this highlighting of innocence does to understanding popular politics, and whether in a place like Bangladesh, where students have led successful political movements, and in this case actually have led a movement that veteran political parties have been unable to accomplish, whether it is even accurate or useful. Of course, the reason behind this insistence on innocence is the claim that the students did not harbor bigger political ambitions and were only focused on their own futures. But when the 9-point demands from the Students Against Discrimination became a 1-point demand, this premise became untenable. This is where a cynical use of innocence became apparent. Citing the actions of the crowd or incidents of crowd violence that was in response to the excessive violence of the state, those in power criminalized the protests as those clearly not carried out by students. So that's why here I also want to talk about this second category, the Chhatro Janota, which is, as I said, a hyphenated entity that has been the agent of populist uprisings in both East Pakistan and Bangladesh. The 1969 populist uprising was led by Chhatro Janota. And if you could follow the kind of Bengali news coming from Bangladesh, you would actually see this shift in language where a movement led by students or Chhatro became a movement led by Chhatro Janota, which kind of represents the kind of widespread sympathy for the student. Chhatro Janota then became a personification of mass political consciousness. The two other figures that I want to briefly talk about, I think will haunt the future of this uprising for a long time, the Razakar and the mob. A lot has been said about how the former Prime Minister's casual dismissal of, and if I may add, venomous response to the students' demand by mobilizing the term Razakar, that in contemporary Bangladesh is a category of othering, it's a category of dehumanization. The term Razakar, of course, refers to the militia formed of civilians in 1971 who sympathized with the Pakistani state and in the name of peacekeeping actually collaborated with the West Pakistani army. Post-1975, the term actually disappeared from Bangladeshi public culture for quite a few years, spanning the regimes of both Ziaur Rahman and General Irshad. As the Awami League came back to power in 2009 and began the process of bringing the war criminals to justice, Razakar again was at front and center of the political language of the Awami League. Since this term has been mobilized to ossify and in the process grossly simplify existing political divisions between the secular, represented by the Awami League, and the Islamists in this scheme, represented by Jamaat-e-Islami and Bangladesh Nationalist Party that has formed alliances with them time and again. So this time, when the students reclaimed the term in response to the former Prime Minister's offhand remark, it was clear that the old language game was not serving the same purpose anymore. And finally, I mean, there's a lot more to be said about this. Other people have written extensively on kind of the culture of accusation that has unfolded around the term Razakar itself. But I wanted to talk about the fourth category, which is something that Dr. Sen also pointed out at the beginning of his comments, and that category is of the mob or the crowd, or what I have elsewhere written as Janota, which in Bengali covers a very large canvas. So Janota is the people, but it's also the unruly crowds and mobs we have seen stomping the grounds of the Prime Minister's residence in the wake of her departure to India. The critique that we have seen, in newspapers, among ordinary citizens, in social media, is that this kind of vandalism, this kind of destruction, means that people don't really understand that, these are actually, property of the state, bought by taxpayers' money, etc. However, I think one needs to push a little further into this narrative, because in Bangladesh and many parts of South Asia, public property is often used as private property by regimes that thrive on force, nepotism, and crony capitalism. At least ordinary citizens perceive it as such. Even the streets, I mean, Bonnie Honig calls the street a public thing. Even the street is not a public thing when you consider how many ordinary citizens have to sit in traffic for hours every time a VIP passes through. Sometimes even ambulances are not spared. So the widespread resentment that this breeds, that under ordinary circumstances most people take for granted, stops them from seeing public or government property as one constructed through taxpayer money, or in other words, belonging to them, the people. So take the example of Ganabhavan itself. I know we have all seen the images, which is Sheikh Hasina's residence while Prime Minister. While in Bengali, the word Ganabhavan means the home of the people, every news outlet, every English media outlet has described it as her palace. And I think herein lies an irony, right? It was guarded as a palace, some might even say as a fort, where very few people ever had any idea how luxurious or palatial it was until the crowds actually went in. The looting and vandalism we have seen are also, I would argue, not reducible to simple economic gain, although most people would probably try to make a buck from selling whatever they could put their hands on. But the material objects found in Ganabhavan, or let's say সংসদ Bhavan, the parliament building, are suffused with the aura of power, a power that until that moment seemed all-encompassing, invincible. In touching, destroying, or pilfering these objects, the crowd saw themselves as partaking of a power that until then was elusive to them. In other words, these objects became what I, as an anthropologist, might describe as fetishes. I could say a lot more about mobs and crowds, but I think I'm going to stop here and maybe come back to some of these points during the question answer.
Thank you, Nusrat, for setting the context very nicely. May I now invite Dr. Dina Siddiqui to...
Could I actually share my screen?
Yeah, please. And,
I sent you the PowerPoint. I just have a couple of things.
Sure. Yeah, could you try sharing? Yeah.
I will try.
Back from Dhaka, so
Sorry.
be able
I
to
did have
about
just one thing. Let's see. Okay, you can see this, right? But actually, I'm going to go here. And I'll just leave this on. It just says that thing says Bibek Kothai, where is conscience? And it was just on a roadside thingy by this guy who I suppose is something like Banksy in Bangladesh. His name is Shubodh, but I'll just leave that there for a minute. Can you see my screen? Am I just talking? Yeah, okay. All right, so thank you, Rona Joy, for inviting me. What I'm going to say at this point, I've just come back from Bangladesh. It's been 2 days and I'm still, and I have to say it was, even though of course my life was never in danger or anything, it was quite traumatic and dramatic in many ways. And I'm still trying to process many things. So my comments are more as an observer over there rather than an analyst at this point. I do think that reflecting, I want to take a moment to reflect on some of the things that stood out to me to help think about the question of what lies next in, as you asked me to reflect on, in the post-Hasina phase and the interim government. I think the first thing I want to underscore is that no one was prepared for the speed with which events unfolded, this sort of jumps in scale, if you will. As Nadine Murshid said on Al Jazeera, it was like living 3 years in 3 weeks. You had no time to really reflect what was going on. So what was a robust, non-violent student protest movement morphed very quickly into a people's uprising, quite organically, but in the face of state brutality. In a way, I don't think the organizers had either anticipated or even worked for. They were not, this was not what was meant to happen with at least with the quota movement, but their movement became our movement in a sense. At one point, one was watching television, watching these students, and then everybody was out on the streets with the students. And it was a very interesting moment in that sense. In the same way, I don't think anyone until very late in the day anticipated Hasina's rather unbecoming departure until the morning of her exit, right? Especially after this very sham January election, everybody seemed to be resigned to having another 5 years of her. So in these circumstances, the point of saying all of this is that everybody's saying, where is a road? Do we have a roadmap? What is our future? I think it's important to remember things are suddenly, newly, completely, radically different, and one needs to take a breath to think about the future. The speed, the crumbling of the edifice at the very end also, I think, indicates something very basic about the Hasina regime, is that how fragile it was despite this show of dominance, right? And this fragility, the fact that she had tried, the Awami League had tried to put party loyalists at every, within every institution, at every layer, also meant that when the collapse happened, it really eviscerated. I mean, suddenly we saw there was, it wasn't a theoretical power vacuum about who would come in. It was suddenly there were no police people on the streets. And that was, that the police are a real illustration, a good example of the way in which you can, the way in which the Hasina regime really undermined institutions. And so there are many calls to rebuild or reform institutions. That task has been made much harder. I think it's not simply a question of getting rid of something called corruption or having good governance. It's going to be much harder in that sense. Second, it's also, I found, that the depth and intensity of emotions generated by the Hasina regime really came out through certain kinds of vocabulary. Two things really struck me. One was akrosh, or resentment, you could say, and the other was atonko, or terror. And you seem to go back and forth between it. And of course, the resentment, as Nusrat has alluded to, there's lots of resentment of what one could call looting of the people's wealth. And that I would tie into the looting in quotes of Bono Bhabon, right? I'd say there's, I can talk about that more. I agree with Nusrat that one can't really dismiss that kind of taking things from, at least from Bono Bhabon, as simply some kind of desire to accumulate wealth. But the terror, I think the absolute terror that you could be detained by the regime if you cross the line, really all of that came out suddenly after July 15th or 16th in a way I hadn't seen. It was bubbling on the surface, the anger and that terror. And this is where I think something like this idea of looking for Bibek is very important. In fact, and this earlier I should have shown, this is from one of the rallies, protests I went to, where one of the students just said, if the police, it was really pointing to the emptiness, the emptying of institutions like the police, right? So in fact, when I didn't go to Bono Bhabon, but I saw people coming back very late in the day, and it was very interesting the things they had. They had like maybe a feather or a trash can or something, almost like a memento. And I think there's a lot more to be said about that. I look forward to what Nusrat says. To me, it seems I have this whole idea that there is a claim on property that belongs to something called the people, that the people then reconstitute and talk about. But anyway, the third thing I think is it was very interesting to see the desire for a radically new Bangladesh that is not attached to the idea of the Awami League in any kind of way. so many people, not just Muhammad Yunus, referred to this as first Shadinata, the second independence. Shadinata 2.0, if for the younger people, right? Yunus said this is our second liberation. And if you looked at the, I spent a lot of time under the curfew listening to rap songs because that's all I had no, and it's very interesting that the resistance, the musical resistance and cultural production was very much about 1952 and 2024. And 1971 was literally almost like cut out, or it was like taking something out of the body politic. And some of those, I'm not making a general comment, just from the sample of songs I saw and slogans I saw. Graffiti, I saw lots of graffiti that said 1971 Badao, right? And to this, I would, the fourth point again I saw is that it was very obvious as we went from the student protests and Hasina calling the students Razakar, that one of the things she's been doing for many, many years is that the Awami League has claimed total ownership of 71, and it's mobilized, it's used this idea of the spirit of 71 to basically justify doing whatever it wants to do, right? To mobilize its supporters. And it's very clear that she, that simply did not work. The students reappropriated it, but nobody else, the students reclaimed it as, okay, then if, we are Razakar, as Nusrat pointed out. But that line simply did not work anymore with a larger audience either. I think she's hollowed out that particular kind of utility of a particular nationalist narrative because it's become, and that is, of course, one of the reasons I think her father's statue was destroyed much to many people's distress. So that's one thing. It is actually today, I do want to mention today is August 15th, the day Mujib was killed. Mujib and his family were killed. So it's an interesting time. It's strange in a sense to be here talking about this. And if we look forward, one of the things everybody is saying, the students and everybody else has made clear is that we don't want a repeat of, we don't want, just because we don't want the Awami League doesn't mean we want the BNP or the Jamaat, and we don't want the same dispensation where you just start valorizing one person over the other. And unfortunately, I believe that August 15th is no longer a national holiday, which I think it probably could be. But anyway, that's one thing. I don't know if I've taken up my 10 minutes. I have a lot more to say, but this might be a good place to stop. I'm going to move on to the actual caretaker government stuff. Or
yeah, well, yeah, you can continue for a little bit more. Yeah.
Okay. Sure. Okay, all right. So I think one of the challenges is not to reproduce the practices of the former regime. I think the hollowness of what Hasina was saying, again, Nusrat was talking about the campus as a war zone. Suddenly, for many of us all over the country, but particularly in Dhaka, Dhaka city sometimes seemed like a war zone, just watching these scenes. And I think it just made people, even some Awami League people, be very resentful. So in terms of the cabinet, the caretaker government, I thought of it as the equivalent of a diversity, equity, inclusion thing that we have in the US that we have to put together. I know, and I don't mean to make light of it, but, they've tried to put in, minorities, women, NGO people. So there's a lot of, of course, somebody, it is a heavily NGOized outfit, I would say. And some people are very, very wary that the battle itself has been lost. And I have to say, ask what battle? Some people think the government is very much a right-wing BNP government. A few people who are much more invested in a radical reordering of the social order are very concerned that despite having a couple of fairly critical people as advisors, this will be another way in which, instead of a real structural change, you'll just have the same old IMF, World Bank dispensation, which won't change the basic inequality, which was at the core of the movement for student quotas. After all, it was really about high unemployment rates, but absolutely bleak futures. And so that, I don't think, is going to change unless there's a radical thing. I do have a lot of hope, though. And I think the caretaker government faces three sets of challenges. One, I've really talked about, rebuilding the administration from the ashes of the of what they have done to it from these hollowed out institutions. But the second is a lot of the rage that came out, some people would say the reason they allowed the authorities allowed, this is all conspiracy theory, if you will, but certainly people were very angry. When I arrived in Dhaka, people were very angry at very high prices of food and everything else. There was serious dissatisfaction, and the student movement protesting seemed almost ready to supplant that, except it didn't, right? But I think, so here is something from a wall that on the way to Shahbag that I took. These are all my pictures I took. It says, Khamuki, what should I eat? Unnoyon lagbe na, pet bhore khete chai. I don't need development. I want to eat well, I want to have my belly full, right? And then there's Kuni Hasina the killer all over. These are things that are saying, Nusrat has this very interesting thing about infrastructure populism. And I think about in development populism, but Sheikh Hasina's government has really tried to justify all of the, what I still call looting. And I'm going to, because of what happened in Ganobhavan, I insist on using this term looting for what Sheikh Hasina's government and all the people, the business people around her have done. And that looting, a shiny face for that looting has been the wonderful bridges and everything else that people then did burn down. And again, there's been a lot of heartache over that, but we can talk about that. But I think that's going to be trying to find an ideological anchor through which you do these reforms rather than giving people more of the same is going to be the biggest challenge. There's violence and the question of minorities I can get to, and that's related to, I think at this point, related also somewhat to India, as well as to how easy it is to dispossess people of land, more vulnerable people. I think there's been a lot of trauma in the last 15 years of just living under Hasina. I've heard lots of people say from the outside, but it could be worse. I suppose implying the Islamists could be in, and the idea is nothing is worse than Islam. Well, I think I would really strongly push back against that and say maybe something could be equally worse, but between all of the enforced judicial killings and enforced disappearances and the absolute uncertainty that you saw, I think uncertainty structures people's lives in Bangladesh so much that people are truly traumatized. And that is something, there's a reckoning with the Hasina regime that will need to be done. I don't know how. Otherwise, I don't know in what way, whether a truth and reconciliation thing, something will need to be done. And I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you, Dina, for that very powerful evocation of what's happening in Bangladesh and Dhaka as we speak. We now turn to Professor Raja Mohan to really speak a little bit about the geopolitics around the sudden collapse of the Awami League government, as well as maybe speak very briefly on India's position going ahead. Raja, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Ranaja. I think it's wonderful to be here on this panel with you to discuss something probably one of the major and consequential moments in South Asia's evolution. Now, in terms of geopolitics, I would say is really the focus at this point is really internal in terms of the how this plays out, the so-called second liberation or the monsoon revolution, how it plays out. But of course, much of the world is waiting to see how this works out. But I think India is in a separate category in a sense. India is so deeply tied to, it's probably, you can say it's the only neighbor. I mean, Bangladesh has a short border with Burma, was really India, 4,000 kilometers border surrounding Bangladesh. So India's, what is internal in Bangladesh gets deeply tied to India because India's own association with Hasina. And we've heard so much about 1971 that India, India is also linked to 71. And therefore, the whole question of Hasina's politics and India's valorization, if you will, we heard that of 1971, has added to the complexity. And then you have the Hindu minority in Bangladesh, which gets caught up in this as well. So therefore, the multiple partitions of the subcontinent, of Bengal in particular, and the deep hidden layers of those keep coming back in different forms. And I think that's where we are. And I think there's one more phase I think we are seeing here now. When Hasina came back in 2009, she had a great opportunity, I think, to heal the internal divisions which had accumulated between 75 and what happened till she came back. She had a brief moment in the late 90s. But I think, as we heard from the previous two speakers, her authoritarianism, her using 1971 to really justify an increasingly repressive rule has made things a lot worse. So the country, she's polarized the country, and I think the consequences of that are here now. So therefore, coming to the larger question of geopolitics, let me put aside the Indian public debate. Of course, these days, social media debate and the policy debate don't seem to be on the same side. This whole imaginary in Delhi that somehow the Americans undercut or ousted her, which she herself, Hasina herself, has lent credence to this by saying, if she had given this base to the Americans, she wouldn't have been ousted from power. But then this trope is quite common in South Asia. We've seen Imran Khan use this argument that the Americans were responsible for his ouster. We've seen Prachanda use this argument in Nepal that the Americans were responsible for his ouster. But then it's kind of given the love for conspiracy theories in India. I mean, I think this has acquired a life of its own. But I just want to say two things here. One, that in fact, Delhi, the G20 summit, I don't know how many of you have seen that picture of Mr. Modi trying to introduce Hasina to Biden on the margins of the G20 summit. And I know for a fact that Delhi tried to bring the two sides together, at least generate some understanding between Washington and Dhaka in the last few months, as the differences seem to be getting quite public. But then the storm and the tsunami that came, I don't think neither India nor the US could have saved her. But this imagination that the US is responsible continues to resonate. But of course, if the US had really backstabbed India, you wouldn't have Prime Minister Modi heading to the US in a couple of weeks, sometime in the mid-September, to go to the US. And I don't see India-US relationship actually at the official level. Anyone has said anything smacking of this massive public social media conspiracy that goes on. So having said that aside, I mean, let me come to some of the how this might play out over the longer term. So the key is how quickly can the new regime stabilize itself. It's not just a question of law and order is one aspect, and also to restore economic activity, because the US and EU major economic partners for Bangladesh. Most of the exports go there, and many companies that are tied to whatever is the garment industry is still important. Therefore, prolonged instability will add to the pressures internally, given the already precarious economic situation. There are also foreign companies, including the oil companies. Many of them would want to know where this is going. So therefore, you have actually that the how quickly the government stabilizes this would be very, very important, because the longer it takes to stabilize this, then the logic of politics plays out. We've seen in all revolutions, those who make the revolution, the divisions within them will start beginning to unfold. Competing players jockeying for position will start happening, and therefore the question of immediate short-term stability then becomes so much more important. But that is complicated by the fact that there is no constitutional legitimacy to the existing government. That is, if the existing parliament had been kept, the parliament had kind of elected a new president, got this Supreme Court Chief Justice to resign. So I think right now it's really just the army and the students. Now, so for them, I think they need to get that some framework constitutionally to make this credible and sustainable. External legitimacy is easier to get. In fact, Yunus is likely to go to the BIMSTEC summit, I believe, which is going to take place in the first week of September, where he'll meet Modi and the neighboring countries. But I think this question of constitutionality today, in fact, the former Chief Justice Sinha of Bangladesh has written in the Times of India today, essentially saying, look, every time big changes were made in Bangladesh, each time unconstitutional means were used. So it reinforces, while there have been repeated revolutions, repeated popular protests, the political change has rarely come through constitutional means. So I think it's an interesting argument, but that's something for Bangladeshis to work itself out. Second, I think for India, of course, I would say we are caught in a trap. In a way, India needs to engage Bangladesh more, but at the same time, it needs to distance itself from the internal arguments about identity, about history, which continue to resonate. As we heard, there is 52, there's 2024, but 71 is gone. But India has so romanticized 71, and India has so tied to the Hasina of 71 that I think this is something, I mean, I've said publicly that India needs to end this romanticization of 71 and understand the domestic dynamics around it in Bangladesh and the complexities that we heard from the previous speakers a little while ago. So I think for India, the challenge is to deal with Dhaka as it is and avoid being identified with any one particular group. That is, it can't be seen as taking sides, especially at this moment. And that problem, of course, becomes even more acute as long as Hasina stays in India. The idea that she was saved from massive, potentially anything could have happened to her that day. But I think refuge is different from if she starts playing politics from India. Then I think already yesterday, the advisor told the Indian ambassador, I believe that's what today's papers say, it's all right, we don't mind Hasina staying in Delhi. But if she starts making statements on the political situation, then I think it will become a problem for India and for Bangladesh. It said it is a problem for Bangladesh if he starts making statements. Therefore, can she find refuge somewhere else? Can India organize it? Those issues become again an important one. The third aspect I wanted to say is on the foreign policy in particular. The new rulers have said that, look, they want to pursue a balanced foreign policy. I think that's been the case. I think even under Hasina, while she built a strong relationship with India, she's also had a clear engagement with even with the EU, with the US, and with others. So therefore, a balanced foreign policy would be what I presume even India would expect, because India knows that given the weight of India, there will be some element of balancing against India, if you will. That's part of the politics in the neighborhood. India must expect some of it. But the key question then becomes that how do we go beyond where we are? So I would say that for India, in terms of what it does to help overcome the economic, yesterday, the advisor again said that, look, supply of essential commodities at this point as things worsen on the ground. That's one major question. The question of border stability becomes another question. And the question of, preventing or managing the flows of people from the Hindus or others from Bangladesh into India across the 4,000-kilometer border. So therefore, again, it gets linked to the stability question. There is a regional option beyond India, of course, but I don't see much of a regional option. While Bangladesh was always the one championing regional integration, the SAARC has gone nowhere. There is the Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Nepal sub-regional cooperation. There's been some significant progress there, but I don't think it can do political settlement of the issues. And then we have the BIMSTEC summit, BIMSTEC Bay of Bengal summit that will take place. So the key then would be whether India, US, and EU, because given the kind of support Mr. Yunus has in the West, that can India and the US, can India and the West work together to help stabilize the situation, to overcome the current crisis, and then help along to move towards reconciliation. I mean, I think that is very, very critical. That if there is a new moment in Bangladesh, I think Bangladesh, the tragic history of Bangladesh, if you don't internally reconcile and create a single national mythology, and if the country is divided on 47, on 71, and probably now, then I think this deep internal, schism, will continue to complicate reconciliation. And my fear is calls are already there to try Hasina for genocide. Then, given the cycles of violence that we've seen in Bangladesh since 47, the idea that at what point do you start accounting for it? Therefore, retribution, we've seen cycles of retribution. Post 75, the retribution against Awami League, and then since has come the retribution against her opponents. So at some point, I think the cycle of retribution, if it doesn't stop, then I think we're only into one more phase of bloodletting, which is not good for Bangladesh, of course, and not good for India or for the region as a whole. Therefore, I think, given the special status that Yunus holds, given the fact that Bangladesh seem to have put 71 behind it, I think the time to come to a new internal compact on what its history is, and then move on towards a new national framework and a new national compact becomes critical. And such a compact, I think, internally would also help India to break away from 71 and to be seen as if somehow we are tied to Hasina, or that we are tied to the Hindu minority within Bangladesh. I think that problem needs to be overcome. So therefore, I think the key again is internal, that whether Bangladesh can move towards a new phase of reconciliation and advancement in which India and the US and Europe must contribute helpfully without being seen as meddling inside. That's the really challenge. So I would say, again, for India, how does it engage more deeply without getting entangled in the domestic politics of Bangladesh? But I think, given the layers of partition in the subcontinent, that's not an easy challenge to overcome.
Thank you, Raja. Setting that's for the complex geopolitics around the current events in Bangladesh very, very nicely. So before I sort of move the conversation forward, may I just remind the assembled online audience, that to send in their questions through the Q&A option, and I see some questions already coming in, and I'll address them in a minute. But before I move on to the audience questions, could I just quickly come back to this idea that was there, I think, in all the three presentations, the idea that 1971 has to be reckoned with. Dina mentioned it, Nusrat very briefly, and Raja too. You talked a little bit about it, and how 1971 has been valorized, of course, both within Bangladesh, as well as particularly in India, and how Sheikh Hasina and the Awami League used that moment. So maybe could I just invite all three or anyone who wants to sort of come back to that question. And I think some of the images, of course, we saw, the protesters, etc., leaving, as Nusrat said, Hasina's palace, and that's, the use of the word palace is very pertinent with, various objects, and there is a meaning to that beyond just sort of looting artifact. There is a sort of cultural meaning to that. But 1971, as well as the legacy of Sheikh Mujibur, the Bangabandhu, and I think many of those outside Bangladesh were somewhat alarmed by the defacing of Mujibur's statues, as well as I think his house, if I'm not wrong, in Dhaka was, or the museum that was dedicated to him was, parts of it was burned down. So I think this idea of the so-called founding figure, and we have so many of them, not just in Bangladesh, but elsewhere in South Asia. Could I ask maybe Dina to step in and say a little bit more about that 1971 and how that is being reckoned with, and if the others want to step in, please do so. Dina, I think you need to unmute.
Sorry. Thank you.
Now
okay. Start again. All right. One of the things that seems very clear now is that in constantly invoking this idea of ekatture chetona, the feeling, the sentiment of at 71, and using it and instrumentalizing it, weaponizing it, using it for whatever purposes, she's not just hollowed out the thing, the meanings, the many various meanings of the event which are out there, but also, in a sense, she's carried it over to her father. So, for instance, she had this diktat, or her office did, I don't know who decided to do this, that every place in Bangladesh, every bank and certain kinds of institutions must have something called a Mujib corner. So Dhaka airport had a big Mujib corner, okay, valorizing Mujib. So if you were in a small bank office somewhere in some obscure part of the, not obscure, I'm sorry, but in a distant part of the country where, you would have to, and you had a little room for a bank, you would still need to make space for a Mujib corner. I just heard this story from the Alam group, if you're interested, Nusrat, but so they couldn't find, at least that's the story, but that says something about, it doesn't need to be true. It says something about the absurdity, how the regime, in order to stay in power, perhaps to manufacture consent, whatever, turned 1971 not simply into a spectacle, but a little bit of an absurdity. And given what else the regime was doing, there was no, it made people deeply resentful of Mujib as well. And let's not forget that after 72, Mujib himself was very authoritarian. In the slide I showed, there was another slide that said Bakshal Hatao. Bakshal was Mujib's thing. So not everybody was necessarily so fond of Mujib after the first couple of years. So it's really not that surprising. I don't think anybody in Bangladesh doesn't feel a strong, at least I don't know what Nusrat would say, but doesn't feel a strong sense of kinship with what 1971. But 1971 isn't just necessarily about the Awami League or Hasina or Hasina's version of the story. Clearly, the figure of the Razakar is very good at telling. If you looked at how it's been used and its different meanings over time, you can see how this is not really that surprising. It's not just Hasina. I keep talking about her as an individual, but these, national narratives are used in particular kinds of ways by all powers everywhere. But I do think that it is interesting that given the sacredness that was attached to 71 by the Awami League, the counter has been, let's just not worry, we're going to go back. So some of the songs say, I didn't see 52, but I've seen 2024. And I found that very striking. For kids who were not born in 71 either, but they're saying, I didn't see 52. So there's a feeling, I think, of the real nation to come that 71 wasn't ever going to perhaps give them. So I'll just stop there.
Yeah, thanks, Dina, for the insights and mentioning, I did see the Bakshal, in that graffiti.
Right.
I think
Can I
one of the things.
quickly add? Oh, sorry, sir.
No. Yeah. Please.
I just wanted to quickly add to what Dinapa was already saying, and to understand the iconoclasm, that has produced so much shock. I mean, there was the Constitution was amended in 2011. It's the 15th amendment that actually, acknowledges Sheikh Mujibur Rahman as the father of the nation, and then how the portrait of the father of the nation has to be at every governmental, non-governmental educational institutions. And in 2019, actually, the High Court ordered that the portraits, they have to be hanging from courtrooms, etc. And the Section 21, and I actually wrote about this, it's in front of me, of the controversial Digital Security Act leaves provisions for punishing anyone spreading or instigating negative propaganda against the liberation war or the father of the nation using digital devices. The penalty can run up to 14 years in jail and or a fine of up to Taka 10 million. And we all know that the Digital Security Act has been used in all kinds of ways to stifle dissent. So when we see iconoclasm like that, statues being attacked, one has to put it in this larger context where anything that is critical of, of the regime or anything, that could be perceived as critical about the father of the nation or the image of the father of the nation was criminalized. So we kind of put that in that larger context.
Yeah. And if I remember, I think the penalty for hurting religious sentiments is less than the penalty for the father of the nation, which I always thought was really, interesting. But
I think we have parallels for this in the US history. I think waving the bloody shirts as the Republicans for a long time after the Civil War kept waving the bloody red shirts to say, look, they gave blood and their soldiers gave blood. But in a sense, it didn't solve the problem. You had the restoration of slavery, you had the states' rights, you had a whole lot of things. So I think by overdoing 71, in a tragic sense, she's undermined, the legacy of 71, undermined her own father's legacy, and what 71 did to this country and its liberation. And then on top of it, I think she's done something. I think in India, at least, we appreciate the fact that she helped transcend the post-partition economic division of the Eastern subcontinent in a way of reviving cross-border trade, opening up the waterways, of making the border a little more secure, reducing terrorism. In many ways, I think she's actually helped restore the historic connectivities that were there across Bengal until 1947, and maybe until 1965 as well. So in that sense, her contribution and the partnership between India and Bangladesh in the last 15 years has actually produced structural change, I would say, in the Eastern subcontinent. Where we can build on that. I think we need to build on that without a reference to 71, without a reference to the internal divisions, because one of the critical ways in which Bangladesh can actually prosper in the coming days is really to build on this economic relationship, because given the logic of geography, there was a question from the audience somewhere, what role does China play? I mean, I think I would say China and Pakistan might see this as an opportunity, or there could be groups in the Gulf who might see this as an opportunity. But my sense is at this point, it's really the internal story of how quickly it stabilizes. And there, I think whether UNOS can mobilize support from US and Europe to bring in economic support, because the success of the last 15 years on making Bangladesh one of the fast-growing economies based on the government exports, can that structure be expanded and reformed, and whether you can get the Western support to facilitate that. Those will be key for the stabilization both over the longer term. And I think the Chinese-style developmental assistance we saw in Pakistan, Sri Lanka, has been problematic, and I think Bangladesh didn't go down that road. So I would say at this point, really, the internal is the key, and then if it stabilizes quickly, then I think how to mobilize external support for renewing the economic growth in Bangladesh. And that, as we said, reconciliation is the key. And I think for India, we should stop saying 71 was the finest moment, and that everything is tied to 71 and Hasina and the Awami League. Hopefully, we will learn that lesson as well.
Thanks for those interventions. I think we have a few questions coming in, although Raja did address a couple of them. So the questions all seem to be not heeding Raja's warning about looking at the internal situation, but I think these are all more or less on the sort of external situation. So maybe I'll just quickly read them off, and Raja, maybe you can also see them. So one of the questions is that in India was, caught flat-footed. It was sort of myopic diplomatically, and why India why and how India did not see, the events in Bangladesh happening, and how culpable is India's own sort of domestic politics in clouding the government's judgment in understanding Bangladesh and Hasina. Do you want to sort of quickly address that? Although you've addressed parts of it in your
I'll briefly say, look, I think the government, if the governments were such far-seeing geniuses, the world would be a much better place. So did India miss the big moment? Yes, of course it did. But then these things happen. I mean, I think you see only what you want to see. And as one of our speakers said earlier, there's a thing which we say, things decline and suddenly they deteriorate into collapse. And that's what we've seen happen. Probably Delhi could see the problem gathering, but it just was the speed at which things unfolded, because after all, it hosted for a state visit just a few weeks ago. But I think that's what I think we should also get over this notion in India that somehow we can shape and control politics in other countries, in our neighborhood. America can't do it in Haiti. It can't fix Venezuela. Recently, they just couldn't fix the election there. So this notion that big powers have somehow can manage politics in other societies, I think it's an illusion. We've seen the US learn this lesson. For India too, this notion that we have the arbiter of domestic politics in the neighborhood, that's an illusion. And I think for India, the policy should be, how do we adapt to the internal change? Because each country, each of our neighbors has politics of its own, agency of its own. And I think empathy for understanding that politics and empathy and capacity to adapt to it is the key, rather than this notion that somehow we are responsible for the politics of the neighborhood, or somehow we have to be taking care of it. I think that's an illusion. And I think hopefully, we've seen, in fact, last few times in Afghanistan, the fall of Taliban, in Maldives, where the India Out campaign, and today the issues against India in Bangladesh. But in each case, we've seen the logic of geography, the growing economic interdependence would mean eventually India has room to correct its course. And I think that's what the story now is about. How quickly can India correct its course and work with it, rather than saying, did we miss the moment? Of course, we did miss the moment. But then I wonder if anybody had seen it coming with such ferocity in the last few weeks.
Right. There seem to be a few more questions, and all sort of directed to Raja. Maybe the audience is also more from India than elsewhere. So you did address the question on the role of China going ahead. I don't know whether you want to say anything more on that. But there's also a question which is somewhat local, given that we are based in Singapore. The impact of the recent events in Singapore. Do you think you want to address that, or it's?
But I'm sure the other participants can chip in as well. I mean, for things I'm saying.
Yeah.
Look, on Singapore, I mean, I would say, look, in fact, at ISAS, we had done an event on how Bangladesh has an emerging economy and how Singapore can take advantage. I mean, a couple of years ago, or no, when I was still there, a few years ago. And I think at one point, given the general sense of Bangladesh as a successful economy, saw many other countries are trying to focus on it. So I think once it stabilizes again, Singapore, both on the investment side, in bringing Southeast Asian capital back into Bangladesh, there's a role that Singapore can play, but then everyone would want to see how quickly things will stabilize inside. And then the question of turmoil in Bangladesh and its impact on South Asia. Look, events of this kind will, of course, will have an impact. The impact of Taliban, the change of return of the Taliban, what it is doing to the Durand line, what it is doing to the Pak-Afghan relationship is quite dramatic. And I think we don't pay enough attention to what's happening there. And I think that turmoil we need to see. And second, even in 71, Sanjay Barua has written occasionally the internal consequences of 71 for India, what it did to Assam, and the continuing question of who is a foreigner in the Northeast. Then this whole question of citizenship amendment, the whole set of issues which came with 71, and the Supreme Court's involvement, the cutoff lines. So it is, again, I think a partition is a horrible gift that keeps giving. And each major turn in the subcontinent has had internal consequences. And I think there's no escaping that. The question is, are we wiser today in each new phase of tumult? Are we wiser to manage this wisely? Are we smart enough to dampen some of the negative tendencies, politically driven tendencies through greater economic cooperation? That is, I think, is the challenge. And this is nothing to do with SAARC, I would say, or even BIMSTEC. It is really about the logic of geography, means how quickly India and Bangladesh can go back to strengthening their economic cooperation, which would boost the economic capabilities in Bangladesh. And I think we know that the trade is one-sided. The question of bringing more investments, greater access to Bangladeshi goods, all those issues which have been debated for so long will become important. But given the problem, the Burma border Burma is also unstable, so which we should expect. This is what some of the things I think Ranaja and all we've explored it. The collapse of the line in Burma between the subcontinent and Burma, that is just beginning to unfold. The collapse of the state in northern Burma, we're going to see a lot more trouble. So I think we're going to have difficult times ahead. And I think to stabilize this, I think we need more cooperation between Delhi and Dhaka, and between Delhi, Dhaka, and the US and Europe, which remain for all the talk about China as being so central. The economic cooperation still with the US and Europe, as well as the movement of people, migrations are still with the diaspora, Bangladeshi diaspora, Bengali diaspora will still play a bigger role in Europe, UK, and the US. And I think that's where I think the real sources of potential stabilization lie externally.
Right. Thanks, Raja. I think you've answered a couple of other questions that have been coming in on whether SAARC has a role, and whether regional initiatives like BIMSTEC will have a role going ahead. So I won't repeat those. There are a few more questions coming in on the domestic situation. One is on I think addressed to all the panelists. How do you see the interim government addressing the deep-rooted issues of political distrust and institutional corruption in Bangladesh? This was something that Dina was talking about. Dina, do you want to address this? I know it's a question that has no sort of a definitive answer, but yeah, you want to?
I don't really have an answer to this. I think of outside of the government things that give me hope. I think I was thinking of a couple of different examples, both of which escape me now. I think talking about nation building and the need for national mythologies that unify people, that Professor Mohan was talking about, in relation to that, what I've seen is a real shift, I think, from earlier moments from, say, the Shahbag movement, which was very narrowly nationalist. This is slightly different, where it seems people have learned. So the language is, for want of a better word, inclusive, but we could even say decolonial in a sense. So people are actually talking about the hills versus the plains, what the military has done to indigenous populations, and having to bring that into the equation when having conversations, not within the government so much, but it's there in the public sphere in a way I haven't seen, and it doesn't get the pushback. It's seen as really important. In the same way, again, at a community level, it has been really interesting to see. There are always, attacks on minorities for various reasons at these moments of crisis. But this time is the first time I've actually seen, and we see people from madrasas and other places protecting temples and other things. There's a different way of thinking about Bangladesh. I might be very optimistic, but even seeing that, even if it is on our Facebook feeds, actually my very close cousin of mine is part of Tabligh, so he sent me what he was doing, and he was, he and his madrasa were, guarding temple. So he sent me this stuff. So these are not made up. Those are little things. This is not answering your question, which is a much harder question, but it is giving you a sense of the possibilities of what the government can do, not just to gain trust means to have a more inclusive space, perhaps. And so this is how I would connect these two things. But I think actually the government will really also need to have some kind of accountability for the violence that took place after August 5th, but definitely for the violence of the last 15 years, if it is going to gain some trust. And that doesn't mean bringing Hasina back necessarily and, whatever, having some spectacular thing, but something that needs to be addressed in some kind of way.
Right.
Oh, and also, sorry, all of the bank defaulters and everybody, people who are having cases run against them, that would be so wonderful, I think, if you really wanted to bring trust back to the people on whoever is ruling.
Right. Thanks, Dina.
add-
did you want to add something?
Yeah, just two very quick things. One might be too specific to Bangladesh's domestic context, is the issue of Shahbag. Obviously, it was much more narrow, but I also think that the Awami League regime at that time could co-opt the Shahbag movement, because it worked, it shored up the same narrative of Rajakar versus whatever. And I actually think that they were brilliant in doing that. And I feel like if they actually used an excessive force language of force at that time, it could have become something else. Because I think it was really kind of very, politically in a very efficacious way, turned into a very different purpose. So there's that. And the issue of distrust, I think one kind of has to talk about Muhammad Yunus as a persona when we talk about, the kind of culture of distrust. This is something I wrote about in my book, which is the earlier moment in 2007, when there was a similar vacuum, which came into being under different conditions, when Yunus was really propped up as the third force in Bangladeshi politics. He was the poster child of NGO efficiency. He didn't have any dynastic, connections, no skeletons in the closet, unless you think microfinance is evil. So that thing is there. And, this kind of heavily NGOized interim government, I think, also plays with that kind of wariness that most ordinary Bangladeshis have about political dynasties. So, if you bring in, because NGOs are still associated with efficiency, a certain kind of efficiency that the public sector doesn't have. and the kind of spectacular corruption that, that it has become, it has become a kind of representation of. So I think, the students had to come up with a name very fast, but I also think that it's one of the few names that would work. How that unfolds is a separate issue, but it is precisely to kind of respond to this deeply rooted and very widespread distrust that people have of party politics. And that's why I think Muhammad Yunus has been kind of, has been the chosen one.
All right. There are more questions coming in. I think an important one is on how different is the current military in terms of its understanding of its roles and factions compared to the military under Ziaur Rahman or Ishaq. Is there a fear of factional tussles, I guess, within the army? Does anyone want to address that question?
I can briefly, I mean, I'm not an expert in any of this. But I mean, the world is a very different place, and military regimes don't enjoy the same kind of recognition and privileges that they did before in the 70s and 80s. And as many people in Bangladesh would tell you, that one of the main sources of revenue for the Bangladesh military now comes from UN peacekeeping. And that's something that the military cannot afford to give up. So there's that. So their own political ambitions, whatever they might be, if they come in the way, that would actually hurt the institution in very different ways. And also, I think it comes back to the issue of trust. I was asked by, one of the interviews that I did was how come people, the military was shooting at citizens just days before, why would they actually trust the military to kind of really oversee peaceful transfer of power? And I think, the wariness of party politics, brought people to a point where they have placed, I would say, conditional faith in the military to oversee a peaceful transfer of power. And I think it would be, Bangladesh, opportunities for democracy were created or arose so many times, and every time it has been hijacked in a number of ways, and people are burdened with that history. So I think people are also watching the military very carefully. I mean, the interim government is under extreme scrutiny, to kind of to see what their intentions are. And I think the faith in the military is circumscribed also by that history of previous regimes with ambitious military.
Right.
Is there a structure? Sorry, Ronoja, and I just want to ask one question to our other two speakers. So when we say the students and two of them are sitting in the cabinet, I mean, what is the structure? What is the kind of, they have an ideology? What is the kind of thing? Is simply idealism that is driving them? How long can they sustain this kind of, so can you tell us something about the nature of the student movement and who they are and where they might go?
Yeah, I think that's actually a question from the audience too.
Okay. Sorry,
on the nature of the student and whether they have a structure. Dina, did you want to?
I just want to say just a little bit, and I think this is actually this is a very important question, because they are idealistic. They had a very specific initially idea in mind of what they wanted to do, but now that they're in power, I think one of the problems is that I don't see any particular kind of anchoring ideology that's moving them, right? So you have the NGO sector, and then you have the Yunus America, people. I'm not sure, and it's very well intentioned to go into markets and what they're doing now, because of course markets are in, prices of basic foodstuff are always being inflated. So they're going in and they're preventing merchants from, shop sellers from doing that. But that's really not a very sustainable thing for the very long run. But this is how they're doing this very hands-on, old-fashioned kind of thing. I don't know that there is really an ideology. They have been very, very organized, though. I believe the organization that they started from was something set up in October of last year, and they've been connecting. They have a lot of experience. Many of them were involved in the 2018 road traffic movement, the accident movement. So they're very organized. They're very coordinated. They're very disciplined. My personal opinion is that I am not entirely sure they, wanting good governance or efficiency or corruption-free governance is sort of almost in a vacuum if you don't have a larger vision. That this is not to say that they haven't been really fantastic, but I can't, this is what I would say. And I do want to say something that's not related, which is, since we're talking about this, one of the things that's been the most, and I'm sure you've noticed it, that's been the most conspicuous in these in the scenes coming out of Bangladesh is how many young girls are out on the streets and young girls confronting the power of the state. And I find that to be very, very interesting. This is not like NGOs are constantly talking about empowerment. There's something else that they're doing through their microcredit or whatever. But you see what these girls are doing. They are not afraid when their brothers are taken away. They're stopping trucks. They're doing whatever. These people are real serious activists on the ground. Whether or not, and their ideology, I think they're also very fearless because under the Hasina regime, increasingly you don't have an option except to maybe fight. You have nothing to lose, or they're going to be picked up, or you have no future, so you might as well fight. So their fearlessness, I'm assuming, comes a little bit from that. That's just my not having talked to them, though.
Right.
But yeah.
And Nusrat, do you want to
very quickly, I mean, both the student leaders who are now part of the, who are now advisors to the interim government were politically involved, but they were actually also they're party activists of a party that, again, has been trying to go outside of Awami League, Chhatro League, BNP, Chhatro Dal, and Chhatro Shibir, which is the student cadre of Jamaat-e-Islami. So they already actually have, I mean, at least the leaders do. The others, larger student body that supported them doesn't necessarily. And as soon as they became advisors, there was actually also a discussion around how they wouldn't be able to participate in the upcoming elections because they're part of the caretaker government, and how they're sacrificing their own political ambitions. So I think there is, again, coming back to this issue of distrust, there is an effort to kind of try to come up with some kind of a political force, maybe in the form of a party, that is not the Awami League, not the BNP, not the Jamaat-e-Islami. So I think there may be some political ambition there. And obviously, that's not everybody, but this highly organized leadership actually, I think, is quite keen on kind of starting something new. What that looks like, I don't know. I'm not Gen Z. And apparently this movement has been led by Gen Z, and there have been many memes, many jokes. I think the funniest one, and I'm just going to say, is a photograph of Sheikh Hasina, where she says in Bangla, it's not my, you're saying Gen Z, I thought it was General Zia. So, but that, I think, encapsulates something.
Genji.
And there was this Genji also, which means t-shirt. But I think there is this kind of idea that we don't really completely understand what they want. It's like it doesn't really fit into kind of an existing framework. And also we have to understand how old they are and what they have seen. They have no memory of 2007. They don't know how Yunus's political party flopped. They basically came of age during this regime. And so they have been stifled for a very long time, and they are much more digitally active. So they have been subjected to Digital Security Act in much more directly. A lot of them don't write in newspapers; they write Facebook posts, right, and blogs. So I think there is something generational about it, and I'm not going to claim that I understand it. I think I'm also kind of like, what is this Gen Z? But I think there is something generational about it that needs to be really explored.
Right. So I think that sort of addresses, in a way, one of the questions on which is addressed to Dina on,
Yeah, she
what
just
new
did.
dispensation might look like, and whether there is, something beyond the already existing party formations, Awami League, PNP.
Right, yeah.
So, Dina, do you want to say anything briefly about anything to add? Yeah.
I think Mr. that I do feel that there might be trying to have a new party, and but I do feel a little bit nervous about, perhaps because I'm just very old-fashioned in wanting my ideology clear about what we want. So that's all. I don't want to add more. I think it's, yeah, they've got a lot going for them.
Right. Okay. I think we've sort of addressed most of it. There's a sort of unusual question at the end on, sort of trust of, the lack of academic collaborations within South Asia academia, and whether that's sort of led to exacerbating misreading, trust deficit. Does anyone want to address that?
Can I say something? There was recently, actually, one thing that hasn't come up is the incredible distrust of India, the government in Bangladesh. And it was very, very, very apparent in the last 4 weeks. And there is tremendous resentment toward India, and a sense that India is really interfering in Bangladeshi politics and economics, and we have to get India out. And related to this question, recently 6 intellectuals from Nepal, Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh wrote in The Wire a piece on how India should keep out of the affairs of its smaller neighbors, and that how Indian scholarship very often doesn't takes its cue from the government rather than doing independent scholarship. So that is out there. That sense is definitely there. And that's something to think about. And I don't know if this person was talking about that, but it is very strong in Bangladesh. And I have talked to Nepali friends for whom this is also the sense of Indian hegemony. So India as the the United States of North America, I think would be perhaps something like a parallel. So that's there, certainly.
I might just respond to that. I think that question of resentment against Indian dominance is quite clear. But we're also stuck together. I mean, that is we can't shake each other off. I mean, I think that's why, just as the Latin America, for all the resentment against the Yankees in South Latin America, they can't shake off the Americans. I think we are stuck together. And I think the logic of geography, but India, Bangladesh in particular, if you have a 4,000 kilometer border, then you can say, look, India out, you can say anything you want. It is just too much. I mean, people don't realize the biggest tourists, so-called foreign visitors to India are from Bangladesh, more than 1.5 million. India gives the maximum visas in Bangladesh. So I think the deep connections are also real. That's where I think the answers are in finding a new compact within the region, where India treats the other governments respectfully, reduces taking sides within the domestic politics of other countries, and gives more economic opportunities as well. I mean, the complaints are not just political. India's non-tariff barriers, India's difficult market to access. So I think there is a lot of agenda. I think some of these issues have been overcome. And I think if evidence is any, that in Taliban came to power, which is really hostile to India, but today they're looking to Indian cooperation. Maldives, which had an anti-India out campaign. Now, Mr. Jaishankar was just there last 3 days, reviving all the projects. So I think in a way, we are stuck to each other. We are interconnected. And I think the question is, how do we build on that interdependence and a new compact in which that interdependence can benefit all of us, and it can't be severed. I mean, even if you want to sever it, it's not possible to sever it.
Right.
I know we're almost out of time, but I just wanted to add one more thing to this. I mean, beyond the, the geopolitics of it, I think one of the things that quite surprised me, I should say shocked me, is kind of the immediate reporting of what happened. There was no mention of the people of Bangladesh. It was all about how, now, who is behind this and what's going to happen. Oh my God, Jamaat is going to, come to power. And this is going back to the question about academic collaboration. My Indian friends or friends in India have been reaching out, asking what should they read, if I have written something, if my friends have written anything, right? Because there was this sense that what they were getting from mainstream media was actually a very, very one-sided and quite, in terms of journalism, very poor journalism, because there was very little mention of the excessive violence that actually necessitated some of the, some of the mayhem that happened later. How many innocent people were killed, and the fact that there was this widespread resentment. I mean, and then as soon as Hasina left, all the focus was on the looting, not at all contextualizing the fact that people have basically, their voices have been stifled for so long. So I think, I mean, I know Shashi Tharoor has said something, in this vein, that instead of investing in, not investing in the leader, maybe, India should first at least think about the people of Bangladesh and maybe the state of Bangladesh, and maybe after that, whoever, heads that state. So I think that actually one of the ways in which this could be addressed is by more collaboration, more interregional discussions of like-minded people, because I don't think our mainstream media is really giving us that.
Ranajay, 1 second, I'll take.
Go ahead.
I would say, don't hold your breath on the media. I mean, given the state of the media around the world, that's the problem. And I think what we really also need is really a greater interface between the civil societies. I think that's not taking place enough. For example, the Indian political parties, they don't engage deeply with the neighboring political parties. Therefore, I think when you talked about Shashi Tharoor, I mean, that there is absolute, India is agreement among all the parties. 71 was the finest movement, and Hasina is a best friend forever. That is what has driven this those absolute assumptions and not seeing the reality, how it has shaped in the last 15 years, has really blinded. So it's not a policy failure. It is a perceptional failure. It's a failure of how we think about history. So therefore, I would say more exchanges between academics, even looking at post-mortem of this event. I hope ISAS will do more events of getting deeper into this whole question and getting the political parties to talk to each other. And I think Congress is no different from BJP. Every single party has come out with the same statement: protect the Hindu minority. So I think it again reduces to a single issue rather than understanding Bangladesh's difficulties with its own history. If we don't understand that, we are trapped. And that's where we don't understand enough our neighbors, their troubles, their dreams, their internal struggles. If we don't pay attention to that, I think India will always be blindsided by what happens inside.
Well, yeah, but I do think there's a sense that what happens inside is really has something to do with what India decides. And that's a perception that, I don't know. I mean, people would say that Hasina did have Indian cover, not in a direct necessarily kind of way. So that's there. Anyway, I'll leave it at that, but I will say that.
Right. I think we could go on. I think it was Dina who quoted someone saying that, we've sort of, lived 3 years.
Right.
In 3 weeks. This is something I think none of us have been able to, fully sort of process or digest. And I guess all of us need to, have more events, talk more. And, I think intra-South Asian collaboration, etc., is definitely welcome. So I know it's very late in the US and we've also crossed the allotted time, so I don't want to keep the panelists any longer. But thank you once again,
Thank you.
particularly to Nusrat and Dina, as well as Raja, for joining this. And we hope to have more such sessions in the near future. Thank you. And could we have a virtual round of applause for all the panelists? Thank you once again.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
good night for the friends in the US.
Yeah.
Good night. Good
Good
night.
night. Yeah, bye.